Hi, everybody. Welcome back for part 2 of our Ukraine series. So we're just going to dive right in. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to dive right in. All right. So again, why is the Ukraine in crisis? Why is Ukraine in crisis? Okay. We're going to dive right into that today. Okay, we're going to look at a little bit more contemporary history. And this part of the history is stuff that you can talk about in context on your IB exams when you're looking at, why Crimea is such an issue, right? Because now we're looking at stuff that's occurring in your lifetime, okay? Or just outside by a year or two, depending on what year you're born. So the decade following independence, various successive presidents, so the series of presidents, allowed oligarchs to gain more control of the economy, while repression against political opponents increased. Now, Ms. Delano, what's an oligarch? So an oligarch is essentially a small group of people that have tremendous wealth and power. Okay. And they're able to exert that power. And so by 2010, Ukraine's 50 richest people controlled half of the state's gross domestic product. That right there, for example, those are oligarchs. Okay. And so what we see is we see a reformist tide, right? So there's quite a bit of a number of reforms taking place post 1991 towards 2000s, and we see this reformist tide kind of peak and start to taper off by 2004 when the Orange Revolution occurs. Okay, and this Orange Revolution gets kind of sparked by a rigged election won by Yanukovych, which brings Viktor Yushchenko to the presidency. And this was highlighted in the short video clip you watched the other day, or 20 minutes ago, depending on what time you watched it. Okay. So what we see is there's a lot of infighting among the elites themselves, which this slows reforms. This creates economic troubles, right? These economic troubles from the fallout, they resurface, coupled with the global economic recession in 2008, right? The subprime market crisis, and so what we see is a revolution that's masking a divide between the East and the West. Okay. So Yanukovych wins the 2010 presidential election in Ukraine, and he campaigned on developing closer ties with Russia. Okay. Many political scientists and economists suggest that he actually reverted to that old system of corruption and cronyism that was rampant in the old Soviet Union. For example, money laundering, right? Embezzling of money, jailing opponents, right? From the election, jailed his reformist opponent. So basically, he had, as the cartoon pictures here, right? He put his opponent in jail, saying that she was abusing power. Where's that abuse of power actually taking place? Okay. So where does the EU come in all of this? Okay. In political cartoons, Russia is often depicted as a pretty significant bear. Okay. Here we've got Uncle Sam, right? And here we've got the European Union. Now, why is Uncle Sam pictured here? Well, naturally, right? The Americans are not allied with Russia. They are allied with Europe. So naturally speaking, they want to help pull Ukraine towards a more European kind of form of government, and with closer ties to the EU. So trade talks continue with the European Union on an association agreement. Okay. And in 2013, everybody pretty much, there were signals that Yanukovych was going to sign that deal in 2013. Not a deal joining the European Union, but a deal bringing closer ties and an association agreement. However, the EU had one condition, and that condition was he had to release the opponent that he jailed, Timchenko. Okay, and I apologize if I got the name wrong. But the European Union said you must release your opponent that you put in jail on charges, so-called charges of abuse of power. But, right, Russia, the big bear on the other side, Putin's pulling, right, and he Ukraine backs out over concerns of European competition. You may have heard of something called the Euromaidan protests. Essentially, these Euromaidan protests were widespread protests in Kiev. And if you remember, Kiev is the capital of Ukraine. And it was termed the Euromaidan because protesters wanted to align themselves with Europe. These are protesters that are pro-European Union. They are speaking out against corruption. They want those ties with Europe. Okay? The government crackdown occurs. These protests have been going on for about 3 months. And as a result, what we see is about 130 deaths in the violence that occurs on the crackdown of these protests. And those deaths are not exclusive to civilians, although they're largely civilians, but it also includes 18 police officers. And so what we see are growing divisions between the East and the West. Okay? And what we also see is fighting between pro-Russian separatists and government forces in April of 2014. Okay? So we see separatists in 2 regions establish self-declared republics, but that's not going to go over super well. So what we see between May 25th, 2014 and August 2014, we see pro-Western businessman Petro Poroshenko move into power. He moves to reassert central government control over resisting eastern cities, so wanting to pull those regions back into the fold. And by August, 2,000 people have been killed. And you've got hundreds of thousands of people fleeing their homes in these regions, according to the United Nations. So the officials in Kiev, the capital, and the United Nations accuse Russia of arming the separatists, backing the separatist militias, and said, Kiev and the UN basically say these rebels in eastern Ukraine were using Russian surface-to-air missiles that were responsible for the downing of a civilian aircraft, MH17. In that crash, 298 people died. But naturally, Russia denies all of the charges, but continuously has deployed thousands of troops along that border. So, what are Russia's concerns in all of this? Because, right, when we think about IB global politics, perspectives is really important. And not just one side of the story, but multiple perspectives, because when you do your IB exams, that's one of the things that they're looking at. Can you include content-specific vocabulary, right? The key concepts of global politics, but also how do you incorporate multiple perspectives in the terms of ideologies and the perspectives of the issues surrounding the issues that you're looking at? Not just that idea of liberalism and realism. So what are Russia's concerns in all of this? What is the perspective? Okay. So for Russia, the Ukraine is an important energy partner. Okay. Energy trade is really significant. Okay. Pipelines going through Ukraine provide the transit for 80% of the natural gas that Russia sends to Europe. Ukraine cuts those pipelines off, Russia's in trouble. And so the Ukraine is essentially a massive supplier, a major supplier of Russian gas, right? They are the transit hub. So energy is one. Militarily, okay, right? Ukraine is a buffer state, right, between Russia and Europe. right? It is also home to a huge portion of Russia's navy, right? Russia's Black Sea Fleet is based in the Crimean city of Sevastopol. Again, I apologize if I mispronounced that. Okay, so basically, Ukraine and Russia have an agreement, a bilateral agreement, so agreement of two countries, that allows Russia to basically park their fleet there. Right? Um, Russia also, so are now onto our third bullet, considers the European Union's effort to expand east towards Ukraine alarming, right? That's encroaching on Russia's territory, right? That expansion, right? That fear of NATO coming closer is a significant fear of Russia's, right? So the EU's Eastern Partnership Program, right? Ukraine's not a part of the European Union, but they're part of a partnership program, ultimately speaking, or attempting to get them into a partnership program aiming at forging tighter bonds between six Eastern Bloc countries. Well, Russia doesn't see that the same way Ukraine and Europe sees that. Russia sees this as a stepping stone to NATO, right? So this is a threat in Russia's eyes. Putin portrays Russia's role in the Ukraine as safeguarding ethnic Russians, right? So this is where Crimea comes into play, right? Crimea has a very large population of ethnic Russians. And so we're going to spend some time exploring that here in a little bit, okay? So Putin essentially stresses that Moscow's not asserting its will, but supporting the free choice of locals living in Crimea, trying to basically parallel Kosovo's independence from Serbia. But it's not seen globally in the same capacity. So, Russia's perspective. Now, what about the European Union? Where do they fit in all of this? So, the Eastern Partnership Program gets established in 2009. Okay, so this is pre-Euromaidan and all of that. Okay, with an attempt to expand political and economic ties between the European Union and six states: Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. Now, this is not an extension of EU membership. This is just a partnership program. Okay? It is not EU membership. But this association ultimately, right, it's ill-fated. It's kind of designed to, it's disastrous from the start. And it included a comprehensive free trade agreement, right? And that was pretty significant. But a lot of people fault the EU for neglecting to consider the geopolitical implications of this when it comes to Russia and declining to map out strategic aims for Europe, in that they didn't do enough planning. Okay. So Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, they signed the deal in June 2014. Okay. Right. This is 5 years after it gets designed, okay, or introduced. Okay. And by Ukraine signing in June of 2014, this was that quote down there from the bottom there, Poroshenko, Ukraine is underlining its sovereign choice in favor of membership with the EU. And you can assume that that's not going to be well received by Russia. So Crimea, because this Crimea is ultimately the portion of the case study that we're really looking at and should be the focus of both your readings that we're going to give you as well as your project. Okay. So when we look at Crimea, okay, so here is Ukraine, here is Russia, this is Crimea, okay, down here, and here's down here in the Black Sea, okay. So prior to the crisis, the autonomous region, so Crimea is considered an autonomous region of Ukraine, so operated by self-government, of about 2 million people. Remember, Ukraine's got about 45 million people, including Crimea, and this Crimean Peninsula has about 2 million people of its own. It has its own parliament, it has its own laws, and these laws permit the use of Russian right in everyday life. Kind of, I would say, I mean, Quebec in Canada is not an autonomous republic or an autonomous region, but it has some laws that differ than the rest of our country. So that would be the best parallel that I could make to kind of give you some context there. So in February 2014, after the ousting of Yanukovych, Crimea's parliament calls for a referendum. Okay. Now, there's influence, there's, right, and we'll get into the details of all of that in a little bit. But so there's this call for a referendum. Okay. Voters voted in favor of a union with Russia, but this is where those global politics terms come into play. The United Nations declares the vote to be illegitimate because there were Russian troops in Crimea at these polling stations, right? Just occupying Crimea. And so the United Nations declares this to be illegitimate due to the large presence of Russian troops all over the country. However, Russia disagrees with that. Russia justifies its actions. Now, when you think back to the United Nations and the time we spent looking at the Security Council and all of that, right? Russia's a permanent member on the Security Council. So the UN, and that's going to hamper efforts to try to delegitimize what's happened here. The United Nations Security Council, right? These other nations attempt to pass a resolution declaring the referendum illegitimate. But of course, Russia has the veto power. Russia vetoes the motion, it dies, right? And here we are. So, right, much like other nations using their veto to support their national interest, Russia was doing the same thing. So, following the vote, Russian lawmakers passed resolutions nullifying Ukrainian laws. And again, the UN sees this all as illegitimate. So Russian lawmakers passed resolutions nullifying Ukrainian laws and instilling Russian laws. That, in a sense, violates this idea that they are an autonomous republic. So Parliament set a deadline of January 1st, 2015 for the integration of Crimea's economic, financial, credit, and legal systems into the Russian Federation. Okay. Ongoing controversy here. Okay. It's very contentious. So when we look at the population of Crimea, right? Crimea has a population that is estimated to be about 59% Russian, 23% Ukrainian, and 12% Muslim Tatars. So the big question becomes, do Russian actions violate international law? When you look at this from the American perspective, they believe that this breaches a series of international laws. One being the non-intervention provisions in the United Nations Charter, right? So the overarching guidelines of the UN and their function. They also say it breaches the 1997 Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation between Russia and Ukraine. So laws developed at the end of the Cold War, right, in the years that followed 1991. They also suggest that it also violates the 1994 Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances. That was signed by the US, the United Kingdom, and Russia, where the document provides security guarantees to Ukraine in exchange for giving up their nuclear weapons. Okay? Naturally speaking, Russia rejects all of the charges that the American government has laid upon them in terms of violation of international law. Right? One of the very many, there's tons of political cartoons floating around out there related to these rules or these elections and referendums, right? Putin and his tank. All of those in favor of joining the Russian Revolution, raise your hands. So me, right? So this idea of coerced voting. So what are policy options for the US and the European Union when it comes to Ukraine, right? What can they do? So divided into four categories. Economic aid, okay? Um, right? So you're looking at loan packages worth $17 billion for Ukraine over 2 years. EU gives hundreds of millions, right? $15 billion support package with payments conditional to Ukraine enacting specific reforms, tough reforms, so ending gas subsidies with Russia. US promises more than $1 billion in loan guarantees, so not giving you $1 billion, but basically being like a co-signer on the loans. Technical assistance. Germany's pledging 700 million in aid to help rebuild war-damaged areas of the east, aid refugees. So economic aid is one. Sanctions. Okay. United States, European Union, Japan, and Canada have all imposed sanctions over time on Russian and Ukrainian officials and businesses. Okay. Now, this might mean travel bans, this might mean asset freezing. Okay. The US and the European Union also later blocked some Russian banks from accessing American and European capital markets. Okay, right, targeting Russian finance and energy and defense industries, right? Because if they can't access the markets, that's going to really impact them. But of course, Russia's going to retaliate. They're not going to take all of this lying down, banning imports of food from the United States and some European states in 2014, in July of 2014, right? This is going to create food scarcity issues, right? Energy aid, okay? American laws exclude the sale of natural gas to countries that are not able to be free trade partners, okay? Now, sale of their natural gas, not the purchasing of of other countries' natural gas, which is an issue in our contemporary society with the Russian-Saudi energy war. But anyways, energy development can approve sales, but that are deemed in the public interest. So the American laws kind of defeat themselves in the sense that, right, the US is saying we're not going to sell natural gas to countries that don't have free trade partners, but they shoot themselves in the foot because they can approve sales that are deemed in the public interest. Right, so experts and lawmakers called for the accelerating of approval of American natural gas proposals to help lessen the reliance on European partners in Ukraine and Russia on natural gas, but nobody could really agree on this plan. It takes a long time and it costs billions of dollars. Military aid is another big one. So the NATO, as you've done a little bit of work with NATO already, just kind of in general, not so much from a peace and conflict perspective, but just from an organizational perspective. They were in your chart. The United States has bolstered NATO's air presence over the Baltic states over time, deploying 600 soldiers in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland to train forces as a part of Operation Atlantic Resolve. NATO's Secretary General also called this crisis the greatest threat to European security since the end of the Cold War. So there's a lot of very active moving parts when it comes to this. So that's where we're going to end for now. What you're going to see is we've put together a document. This is your task for this week. Okay, what has Russia gained from annexing Crimea? It's about 24 minutes in length. This is in a Google Doc with these questions and the video link. So this is your task for the week. Complete it thoroughly, get 100%. Nice little grade booster for you. So questions to consider. How has Russia benefited from the annexation of Crimea? What were the costs? And overall, was it worth it? What was the role of the sanctions throughout this period? And what can be said about their effectiveness? And to what extent does Russia have legitimacy in Crimea? That ultimately is the question of this whole case study that we're in. So, watch that video clip, complete your 2 readings, and then we'll pop in with 2 readings for you next week. Have a great day.